The office at Sutton Co hummed with the low buzz of conversations, the clicking of keyboards, and the occasional ring of a phone. The atmosphere was polished, almost sterile, a reflection of the company's reputation for exclusivity. The employees moved with purpose, but there was an unspoken hierarchy, an invisible line dividing those who belonged and those who didn't. Elijah Carter sat at his desk, the corner of his laptop screen just barely hiding the stack of reports he had meticulously prepared over the weekend. His tie was slightly loosened, and the faint lines under his eyes hinted at the late nights he had spent perfecting his latest proposal. It was his chance to make an impact, to show that his ideas could propel the company forward. "Carter," barked a voice from the other end of the office floor. Elijah looked up to see Richard Hayes, the CEO, gesturing for him to follow. Richard's smile was thin, almost patronizing, as if he had already dismissed whatever Elijah was about to say. Elijah stood, smoothing his shirt before gathering his materials. His palms were slightly damp, but he steadied himself. This was his moment. Inside the sleek conference room, sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting off the glass table. Executives in tailored suits sat in a semicircle, murmuring to each other as Elijah took his place at the front. He placed his notes on the table, his voice steady as he began. "I've been analyzing market trends in underserved communities," Elijah started, his voice confident. "There's a significant gap we can address, one that not only boosts our revenue, but aligns with our values as a company." He clicked to the next slide, revealing a graph that illustrated untapped market potential. The room quieted as heads tilted forward in interest. Elijah continued, "If we implement targeted outreach and community partnerships, we could expand our client base by 25% within the next fiscal year." For a moment, there was silence. Elijah glanced around the room, noting the faint nods and whispers of agreement. But just as his confidence began to solidify, Richard cleared his throat. "That's interesting, Carter," Richard said, leaning back in his chair. His tone was sharp but laced with feigned politeness. "But don't you think it's a bit optimistic? These communities don't exactly align with our brand. They're not our target demographic." Elijah's chest tightened. "With all due respect, sir, I believe this strategy could redefine our brand in a way that—" Richard raised a hand, cutting him off. "Let's stick to what we know works," he said with a dismissive chuckle. "We don't need to venture into uncharted waters to succeed." Laughter rippled through the room, though it was clear some of the executives weren't entirely in agreement. Elijah felt his cheeks burn, but he swallowed the lump in his throat, nodding curtly as Richard moved on to the next agenda item. Later that day, Elijah sat at his desk, staring at his untouched lunch. The words from the meeting echoed in his mind, each one sharpening the edge of his frustration. He had worked so hard, poured himself into that proposal, only to be dismissed without a second thought. "Hey," came a soft voice. Elijah looked up to see Naomi, his closest friend and confidant at the company, leaning against the desk. Her brow furrowed as she studied his expression. "You okay?" she asked gently. Elijah sighed, shaking his head. "It's like, no matter what I do, it's never enough. I gave them a solid plan, something that could actually make a difference, and they laughed me out of the room." Naomi pulled up a chair, her tone firm but kind. "Elijah, you can't let Richard get to you. She paused, choosing her words carefully. "He's stuck in his ways. That doesn't mean your ideas aren't valuable." "It's not just him," Elijah muttered. "It's the whole system. They don't see me. They never have. I'm just there." Naomi reached over, placing a hand on his arm. "You're not just there. You're brilliant, Elijah. And if they can't see that, it's their loss. But you can't let them define your worth." Elijah looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. For the first time that day, he felt a flicker of hope, a faint ember of resolve. 2 days later, Elijah was called into Richard's office. The room was imposing, with dark wood paneling and a massive desk that seemed to dwarf anyone who sat before it. Richard didn't look up as Elijah entered, his attention fixed on a stack of papers. "I've been reviewing your performance, Carter," Richard began, finally meeting Elijah's gaze. "While your ideas are creative, they don't align with the direction this company is heading." Elijah felt his stomach drop. He already knew what was coming. "I'm reassigning you to a different role," Richard continued. "Something more fitting to your strengths." The words stung, their implication clear. Elijah's hands clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to remain composed. "May I ask why?" he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Richard leaned back, his expression indifferent. "It's a better use of resources," he said simply. "I'm sure you'll excel in your new position." The meeting ended, and Elijah walked out of the office feeling as though the air had been knocked out of him. He returned to his desk, the weight of humiliation pressing down on his shoulders. That evening, Elijah sat in his small apartment, staring at the city lights outside his window. His thoughts raced, a mixture of anger, sadness, and determination swirling within him. He pulled out a notebook and began jotting down ideas, his mind returning to the proposal Richard had dismissed. "If they won't see my worth, I'll show them." The words echoed in his mind as he worked late into the night, the faint ember of hope growing into something stronger, a quiet resolve to reclaim his dignity and prove them all wrong. The air in the office was thick with unspoken tension. Elijah sat at his desk, his shoulders hunched as he sorted through a pile of files that no longer held any meaning. Once, these tasks had been stepping stones toward his goals, but now they felt like chains keeping him from his potential. The demotion had been swift and humiliating. "Carter, make sure these reports are done by the end of the day," barked one of the senior managers, dropping another stack of papers on his desk without so much as a glance. Elijah clenched his jaw, but said nothing. He'd learned that speaking up only made things worse. He buried himself in the monotonous work, his mind wandering back to the strategy he had presented weeks ago, the one that had been laughed out of the room, the one Richard had dismissed as impractical. A pang of frustration hit him as he thought about how that single moment had shifted his entire career trajectory. At lunch, Elijah sat alone in the break room, staring at the bland sandwich in his hands. Two colleagues entered, their voices low but audible enough for him to catch snippets of their conversation. "I mean, he's clearly not cut out for the big leagues," one said with a laugh. "Right? I don't know why he even thought he'd get anywhere with that presentation," the other replied, smirking as they glanced in his direction. Elijah looked down, pretending not to hear. His chest felt tight, a familiar ache that came from years of being underestimated and overlooked. He'd thought he was past this, that his hard work would shield him from the biases he'd faced his entire life. But here it was again, rearing its ugly head. That evening, Elijah sat in his apartment, the city lights casting long shadows across the room. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional honk of a car outside. He stared at his reflection in the window, feeling the weight of his frustration and helplessness. "Why do I even bother?" he muttered to himself. The question hung in the air, unanswered. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Naomi. "I heard what happened," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Are you okay?" Elijah let out a bitter laugh. "Define okay. I'm sitting here wondering why I keep trying when nothing I do seems to matter." "Don't say that," Naomi replied quickly. "You're one of the smartest, most hardworking people I know. This isn't about you. It's about them." "Easy for you to say," Elijah muttered. "You're not the one stuck doing grunt work while your ideas are ignored." "You're right," Naomi admitted. "I don't know exactly what you're going through, but I do know that you can't let them win. You have too much talent to waste on a company that doesn't see your worth." Her words hit him like a jolt of electricity. For the first time in days, something stirred within him, an ember of determination. "Maybe you're right," he said softly. "Maybe it's time I stopped waiting for them to notice me and started proving it on my own." "That's the Elijah I know," Naomi said, her smile almost audible through the phone. "Now, what's your next move?" The next morning, Elijah reached out to Mr. Lewis, a retired entrepreneur who had mentored him during his early career. They met at a small cafe, the warm scent of coffee and fresh pastries offering a brief reprieve from the cold reality of the corporate world. "Elijah," Mr. Lewis said with a nod. "It's been a while. What brings you here?" Elijah hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I need advice. I feel like I'm stuck, like no matter what I do, I'm always a step behind because of who I am." Mr. Lewis studied him for a moment before leaning forward. "Let me tell you something, Elijah. The system wasn't built for people like us to succeed, but that doesn't mean we can't. The question is, how badly do you want it?" "I want it more than anything," Elijah said without hesitation. Then stop waiting for their permission, Mr. Lewis said firmly. Build something of your own. Take that idea they dismissed and turn it into something they can't ignore. Elijah walked out of that cafe with a renewed sense of purpose. Over the next few weeks, he poured every ounce of his energy into building the foundation of his own consulting firm. He revisited the strategy Richard had laughed at, refining it until it was sharper, smarter, and impossible to dismiss. The early days were brutal. Securing clients was harder than he'd anticipated, and there were moments when he questioned if he had made a mistake. But each setback only fueled his determination. Months later, Elijah sat in a small office that doubled as his living room, staring at the email on his screen. It was from a local nonprofit interested in his services. It wasn't a huge contract, but it was a start. He closed his eyes, allowing himself a brief moment of relief before diving back into work. As the months turned into years, Elijah's firm began to thrive. His focus on empowering small and minority-owned businesses earned him a reputation as a trailblazer. Awards followed, along with bigger contracts and invitations to speak at industry events. Through it all, he never forgot the moments that had driven him to this point. The dismissals, the microaggressions, the blatant prejudice. They had shaped him, but they didn't define him. And now, he was in a position to ensure no one else would have to endure what he had. Sutton Co. was unrecognizable. The once prestigious company had fallen into chaos, crippled by mounting debt and dwindling profits. Richard Hayes stood at the head of the boardroom, his usually confident demeanor now clouded by stress. He shuffled through the financial reports, each page telling the same grim story. "There's no other option," he muttered, finally breaking the silence. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. "We'll have to sell," Richard said flatly, his tone devoid of the pride he once carried. Murmurs of shock rippled through the room. Sutton Co., the company Richard had built his reputation on, was being forced into acquisition. "This isn't the end," Richard added, trying to inject confidence into his voice. "The buyer will bring stability. And with the right adjustments, we'll rise again." The board nodded reluctantly, though the weight of failure was palpable. None of them dared ask the one question lingering in everyone's mind. Who is the buyer? The announcement spread quickly through the office, fueling rumors and speculation. Employees whispered in the break room, their curiosity growing with each passing hour. "Do you think it's that private equity firm?" one employee asked. "Maybe," another replied, lowering their voice. "But why so much secrecy? Feels strange." By the time the day of the acquisition arrived, the tension was unbearable. Richard stood at the front of the boardroom once more, his expression carefully neutral. The doors opened, and a figure stepped inside. It was Elijah Carter. The room fell silent. Richard's eyes widened, his mouth opening slightly before he caught himself. Elijah walked with calm authority, his gaze steady as he approached the head of the table. "Elijah," Richard finally managed, his voice tinged with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" Elijah placed a folder on the table, his movements deliberate. "I'm here," he said, his voice steady but laced with quiet power, "because this company is now mine." The silence was deafening. Richard's face turned a deep shade of red as he struggled to process the words. One of the board members broke the silence. "Yours? But how?" Elijah met the man's gaze with unwavering confidence. "Over the past 2 years, my firm has grown significantly. We've acquired multiple businesses, each one aligned with our vision of innovation and inclusivity. When the opportunity to purchase Sutton Co. arose, it was a natural fit." Richard's hands clenched the edge of the table. "This is a joke," he said sharply. "You think you can just waltz in here and take over?" Elijah raised an eyebrow. "I didn't waltz, Richard. I worked hard. Something you should be familiar with, considering how much of it I did for you." The tension in the room thickened. Richard opened his mouth to respond but stopped when Elijah continued. "I don't hold grudges," Elijah said, his tone calm but firm. "But I do believe in accountability. Sutton Co. has been stuck in the past for far too long. That ends today." The meeting adjourned, and Elijah requested a private word with Richard. In the now empty boardroom, the two men faced each other. "Let me guess," Richard began, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're here to gloat?" Elijah shook his head. "I don't need to gloat, Richard. The facts speak for themselves. This company's downfall is the result of poor leadership and outdated thinking. Richard scoffed. Outdated? Please. I've been running this business longer than you've been in the workforce. And yet, here we are, Elijah replied evenly. Your refusal to adapt, your inability to see beyond your biases, it all led to this moment. Richard leaned forward, his tone accusatory. You think you're better than me, don't you? Elijah's expression softened, but his voice remained firm. I don't think I'm better, Richard. I think I'm different. I know what it's like to be dismissed, to have my ideas ridiculed, to feel like I don't belong. And instead of letting that break me, I used it to fuel me. Richard stared at him, his face unreadable. You had the chance to create something great here, Elijah continued. Instead, you let your ego and prejudice get in the way. But this isn't about you anymore. It's about the people who work here, the future we're building. In the days that followed, Elijah wasted no time implementing changes. He held town halls with employees, listening to their concerns and sharing his vision for the company's future. Diversity and inclusion became central pillars of Sutton Co.'s new mission. Programs were introduced to mentor underrepresented employees and foster innovation at all levels. Richard, unable to reconcile his outdated mindset with the company's transformation, announced his resignation. His departure was met with a mix of relief and quiet celebration. Late one evening, Elijah sat alone in his new office. The weight of the journey he had taken settled over him, but so did a sense of fulfillment. He glanced at the wall where a plaque had recently been installed. The words etched into it read, "Excellence is not bound by prejudice." As he leaned back in his chair, a knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was a young intern, clutching a folder nervously. "Mr. Carter," the intern began, "I have an idea for a new project. I thought, maybe you want to take a look?" Elijah smiled, motioning for the intern to come in. "Let's hear it." And as the intern began to speak, Elijah felt a sense of pride. This was the legacy he wanted to build, a space where everyone's voice could be heard, where talent and determination mattered more than anything else. The office hums with renewed energy, a stark contrast to the tension that once permeated Sutton Co. Elijah stands at the center of a packed conference room, addressing the employees who had witnessed the company's decline and its hopeful transformation. His voice is steady, filled with conviction. Today, Sutton Co. begins a new chapter, Elijah says, glancing around the room. One that prioritizes diversity, inclusivity, and innovation. These aren't just words. They are principles that will guide every decision we make. A ripple of murmurs moves through the crowd, but the majority of the employees listen with quiet anticipation. We will no longer be a company that thrives on exclusion, Elijah continues. Instead, we will lead by example, creating opportunities for those who have been overlooked for far too long. Together, we will build something extraordinary. There's a pause, and then a single clap breaks the silence, quickly followed by more. The room erupts into applause. For the first time in years, Sutton Co. feels alive. A month later, Elijah sits in a meeting with the leadership team. The faces around the table are markedly different, more diverse, more reflective of the company's new values. One of the new executives, a woman named Clara, presents the first major initiative. "We're launching a mentorship program," Clara explains, her tone confident. "It will pair experienced employees with underrepresented team members, focusing on professional development and growth." Elijah nods. "Excellent. Make sure we also set aside resources to support employees who want to further their education or develop new skills." Another executive chimes in. "We've also identified local communities where we can make a real impact. Investments in schools, small businesses, and job training programs could help break cycles of inequality." Elijah leans forward, his expression serious but hopeful. "This is exactly what we need. Sutton Co. will no longer be just another corporation. We'll be a force for good." Richard's resignation is announced quietly, a single email sent to the company. No fanfare, no farewell party. For most employees, it's a relief. His departure feels like the final step in shedding the toxic culture that had once dominated the workplace. "Good riddance," one employee mutters as they read the announcement. Another nods in agreement. It's about time. Elijah stands on a stage at a conference, addressing a room full of young professionals and entrepreneurs. His story is well known by now, a tale of resilience and transformation. When I was younger, Elijah begins, I believed that hard work alone would be enough to break through barriers. But the truth is, the system wasn't built for everyone to succeed. He pauses, letting the words sink in. That doesn't mean we stop trying. It means we work harder, not just for ourselves, but for those who come after us. It means we fight to change the system itself. The audience nods, some wiping away tears. Elijah's voice softens as he concludes, your success is not just about you. It's about the impact you can make, the lives you can change. Never forget that. One weekend, Elijah visits the neighborhood where he grew up. The streets are familiar, but the faces are new. He stops at a community center, where a group of teenagers is gathered for a workshop. Are you really Elijah Carter? One of them asks, wide-eyed. Elijah smiles. I am. And I hear you've got some ideas you want to share with me. The teens light up, eagerly presenting their business concepts. Elijah listens intently, offering advice and encouragement. As he watches their enthusiasm, he's reminded of his younger self, dreaming big despite the odds stacked against him. Back at the office, Elijah walks through the rebranded headquarters. The atmosphere is vibrant, filled with a sense of purpose. He stops to admire a plaque on the wall. The words etched into it read, "Excellence is not bound by prejudice." A voice pulls him from his thoughts. Mr. Carter? A young intern approaches, holding a folder. I was wondering if you could take a look at this idea I've been working on. Elijah smiles warmly. Of course. Let's hear it. As the intern begins to explain, Elijah feels a deep sense of fulfillment. This is what it was all about. Not just his success, but the legacy he was leaving behind. The day winds down, and Elijah stands at the window of his office, looking out at the city skyline. He allows himself a small smile, the weight of his journey giving way to hope for the future.